Thank you everyone for joining us. And Professor Sonnenfeld, thank you for joining us today and being such a great friend to the World Affairs Councils across the country. Before we get started, how are you staying safe and well during this time?
Me personally?
Yes.
Our COVID cave is in Branford, Connecticut, so we're hunkered down on the coast where we have the beautiful views of Long Island Sound that we tell our international friends when they see a strip of land on the other side that it's England, and don't realize it's only Long Island Sound and not the ocean. But it feels beautiful here with a pristine forest behind us. So there are many days, in fact, every day, we feel quite guilty with the massive suffering that there is out there in terms of the public health crises and the catastrophic economic collapse that so far we personally are holding up very comfortably. And our biggest tragedy, which is not much of one, is just the sadness of having just had commencement this week without the usual pomp and circumstance. Elgar's Pomp and Circumstance actually was launched at that famous song at a Yale graduation, a Yale commencement, and it's just so sad not to be able to meet the parents and celebrate our graduates leaving. But there's a lot more suffering in the world than that. But oh my God, Megan, what a galaxy of stars you have had with David Sanger and General Petraeus and John Allen, and it's a daunting list to follow. I remember once, although surely this audience is too young to remember, Johnny Carson had once said, never follow animal acts, never follow children onto stage. If I had really paid attention to the lineup you've had, I would have said, let's wait a few weeks, I need some space. But everybody you have is so great that I am really honored to have joined you, and not just the speakers, but as you mentioned, I've been working with the World Affairs Clubs in local and chapters and nationally for quite some time. And I'm a huge fan of what your organization represents and all your constituents. So thanks for this invitation, and we're holding up just fine.
That's great. And we're so honored to have you, especially at this time. So if we look at the world today, 4.8 million people around the world diagnosed and tested with positive for COVID, about 323,000 deaths. About 1.5 million of those cases are here in the United States. But as we sit here today in Connecticut, both you and I, we know that Connecticut today was phase one reopening. And, we're one of the last states to do so. And around the world, we're seeing, people starting to reemerge and enter a new phase of this long campaign against COVID. And what we're seeing is that what we're feeling and seeing is an absence of unified national leadership. And I want to ask you, how are we seeing corporations stepping up to meet that public need during this pandemic?
That is such a good opening question that we really could spend the next week, or at least the rest of this week, on it. So let me prattle onward until you can't stand it anymore. We have until dinner time, right? Is that? No. So seriously, don't let me go on to it. It's such a good opener question. For example, this is a great day in Connecticut. This is our opening. We're at sort of at the end of the list of cautious states in reopening, and the governor has been a very ambitious governor. I'm a big fan of his. In the interest of full disclosure, we've been friends for 40 years. His former rival, Bob Stefanowski, has been a friend of mine for a quarter of a century. I like them both quite a bit, and I was hoping for a more bipartisan spirit nationally, but also in this state. And the governor's ratings, which were mixed, have actually been soaring lately, until today's controversy, of course, of some confusion over the closing, the delayed opening of the haircutters. And I guess that was at the haircutters' request, but still, what we're seeing is a breakdown of some of the bipartisan spirit. If you look at the weekend shows on the Face the State and Capitol Report, is the commentators of any political party have been very supportive of the direction the state's leadership has taken, which is really great, until we see today's news of the Ray Dalio, the Dalio family gift, Ray and Barbara Dalio, of $100 million to support public education. But somehow some rift has broken out, and as I understand the reports, the Dalios have pointed their fingers in the direction of one party, the the minority party, unfortunately, for somehow not supporting this tremendous gift of public education. I don't quite know the details of it all, but it's just really sad to see this breakdown locally when we thought Connecticut had really come together. And nationally, yes, you're really right that this is it's tragically become a cliche to take a look at the finger pointing which has taken place on a national level. But where's the silver lining in here with many of the usual voices that have been strangely silent in the CEO community? Other CEOs have been filling the void. Warren Buffett has been very thoughtful in the last few weeks, but not too high volume and largely absent. AWOL, he usually has great insights on every national crisis. Bill Gates has been fantastic in the last few weeks, and of course, behind the scenes, been working so hard on drug development. But in terms of public voice, not till recently. Jamie Dimon of course, of JP Morgan has been recovering from surgery. He's now back in the swing of things, and that's great. We welcome him back. Howard Schultz of Starbucks fame has been largely silent, which is shocking. So a lot of these usual voices are absent, but we're seeing a whole new cohort of CEOs out there. Just this morning, the CEO of Walmart, Doug McMillon, was on, and he's been quite, I think, an inspiring but humble leader. He now leads the Business Roundtable, but not talking his own book. But it's interesting. It was March 12th. Before any of these lockdowns started, we had the greatest plunge in the stock market since 1929. And then the next day, Friday, ominously Friday the 13th, it got worse. And as the president was out on the White House lawn, the longer he spoke, the more it continued to plunge until he trotted out a whole bunch of business titans, which included the CEOs of Walmart, Target, Walgreens, CVS, and others. And it was the largest surge. The whiplash was incredible in a stock in American history. It was just unbelievable from the 12th to the 13th. But it was the closing minutes of the 13th, before the closing bell on Friday, that it soared. And again, this is not Warren Buffett or Jamie Dimon or Kevin or Howard Schultz or others, but the CEOs that stepped up. It wasn't just blather, it wasn't talk, it wasn't empty cheerleading. They did various things. Starbucks offering to pay employees through the next few months of shutdown, regardless of whether or not they showed up for work. Alan Jope, the CEO of Unilever, was protecting their workforce they said for 3 months. James Gorman, who is not usually a touchy-feely sort of CEO, the CEO of Morgan Stanley, was similarly provided workforce stability, which was pretty incredible. Hilton, Marriott, they had massive furloughs, but they did it in an honest, transparent way, which was really great. And I could sort of go on these kinds of examples of workforce management. But another thing that CEOs did, which was really terrific, was the philanthropic gifts, which are enormous, from IBM and Apple and others, in terms of these millions and millions of masks, or actually product retooling, as we saw at Honeywell and Mary Barra at GM, Darius Adamczyk at Honeywell, in terms of the manufacturing of PPE and ventilators. 60 Minutes did a special on what GM and Mary Barra did, which is really fantastic. And there's an Edelman study. As you know, they always do this annual trust barometer. They came out with an update just in this last month. Instead of it being the usual January annual report. And this study of 10,000 people found that basically half of the people they surveyed trusted the private sector and public sector to work together better than separately. But overwhelmingly, 92% wanted their CEOs to speak out. And also overwhelmingly, it was their bosses, their employers, they trusted more than the media, but they trusted more than any public officials, to your opening question. I should probably stop right now. I'm going to do a filibuster on you, but it's the voice of the CEOs, in short, that have really been filling a vital gap. Jim Burke, the legendary CEO of Johnson & Johnson, had told me once, and he led the Tylenol recall. He said that institutional trust is real, palpable, and bankable. It's our most valuable asset. And he worried that it can be forgotten, and this can't be overstated. The voice of the CEOs have been critical here.
So let's expand upon that. So when we talk about and we see corporations around the world distributing PPE, you know, Alibaba bringing PPE to places in Europe and in Africa. And do you think that the corporations have a new sort of public role in protecting public health during a crisis like this? Because we have seen there be a lot of tension between international organizations at this time. Do corporations have a new public role when it comes to this public health crisis globally?
Another fabulous question. Of course, the Business Roundtable declaration of social impact and stakeholder capitalism got a lot of attention last August. It wasn't a complete reversal the way the media and some ideologues have played this. In fact, the Business Roundtable was founded on those principles. Those 200 business leaders, David Rockefeller of Chase Manhattan and Garvin of Exxon and Tom Watson of IBM, Irving Shapiro of DuPont. I knew every one of those guys personally and well. They founded the Business Roundtable in 1970 as the breakaway from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the National Association of Manufacturers that were taking positions on the Vietnam War or environmental sustainability, which at that time was obviously about called conservation and pollution control, but had more of a punitive sound and focus to it, is that they wanted to take a more strategic focus on sustainability, on diversity, which was affirmative action back then, but they led the way. In fact, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act was sponsored by many on the Business Roundtable, such as Raytheon. So in terms of social impact, they found their voice again. They lost it for a long time, but they created it in 1970. They lost their way. They found it again this fall, but some thought it was greenwashing, that it was empty PR blather. To your question, Megan, now this crisis brings it to the fore. It's a real test. Do they really mean it? And with rare exception, it seems that they do mean it right now, and it has made public health, for example, has become a critical issue. The woman who's just stepped down as CEO of Hudson's Bay Companies, which is Saks Fifth Avenue and other retailers in trouble right now. She said that she stepped down because they took it private. Helena Folks, she said that what had been the tertiary focus on issues as employee welfare and public health has become the front burner strategic issue. And it's going to be hard to see that recede. And some of it is, you look at the news beyond the openings today, say the Mall of Georgia or the, I think it's up in Cobb County or closer into Fulton County in Atlanta is the Phipps Mall or Phipps Plaza or Lenox Mall. They're empty, even though they've been open now for almost 2 weeks, as most of the establishments are pretty much abandoned. And that's the old, probably everybody on this call is too young to remember but I remember in the late 1960s, there was a tortured version of an old Robert Frost poem that basically the verse was, suppose they throw a war and nobody shows up. That was an anti-war statement, but the relevance today is just because we're opening up for business doesn't mean people are going to come. We're seeing today's news is that we're seeing the stocks soar in the in transportation space, and that surprises many of us. But are there customers really going to go? Public health is absolutely critical. And the warfare between international associations, the World Health Organization, of course, has been under fire, and Lancet has come to their defense yesterday, saying that the president mischaracterized anything that they supposedly said about China in in December, rather, which they didn't say at that time. And all this and that has led to a lot of the finger pointing that we have in domestic politics. We see it in international politics. The CEO community, as they did in South Africa with the Sullivan principles for how to have people of different races work side by side, the business community can do it collectively or individually, like a great company like UPS did when they went into Germany in the 1970s. They said, what are you talking about? Guest workers, which were immigrants, are going to work by German nationals or we're not going to function here. This is the way we operate. And it wasn't considered appropriate for cultural relativism to when in Rome, be like Rome. UPS said, no, that's not the way we operate. Just like when IBM and General Motors went into South Africa, they said, that's not the way we're going to operate.
So you mentioned before, I'm going to start with an audience question here, that the usual voices are a bit silent and that you're seeing a new generation or a new group of leaders emerge. Why do you think some of those traditional business leaders' voices are quiet? And do you think that this moment of national and global crisis is changing the CEO mandate?
Yeah, I'm going to stop saying great question because so far every one of these has been so good. And that is a very thoughtful issue, though, because I know that we're public and I know everybody has attorneys these days, but I still wanted to be specific in answering the question. I really think that a lot of the familiar voices of the CEO community are used to being right. And some of the truisms that others might utter, they couldn't get away with right now because the uncertainty was too high. The chance of being proven wrong as they saw various White House edicts, decrees, and pronouncements didn't match up to reality, and presuming that they were well intended, that people didn't know, that there's a lot of confusion. There still is some different points of view, even in the public health community about certain things, is that some very prominent business leaders that have a stake in being right didn't want to take a risk of being wrong. There's a certain degree of hand-wringing and cheerleading that they often would do that they thought perhaps wouldn't match up as data was unfolding. I also think that some of the cliches that people were offering, they didn't want to offer. Tomorrow's another day, take your lumps, or some of the other empty cliches. This too shall pass. Like, who on this call, let alone who on the street, couldn't say that? That's not giving any value added. This too shall pass. Yeah, how long and at what cost and when and who suffers? And it's a stupid statement. So these prominent CEOs didn't want to make stupid statements. They weren't quite sure what to do, frankly. So that's some of it. Others, became so politically sensitive so quickly that some of those same names have become gun shy of fear of political reprisals from the White House, didn't want to speak out. This new cohort of CEOs that I'm talking about figured out, for the most part, how to thread the needle, how to speak specifically, address issues, and not have them become politicized, but to do the right thing. So I think that's some of it, is that some of it we didn't know what the right answer was. As the CEO of McKinsey told me, now that I'm naming names, Kevin Sneeder said in my class just recently that he found that a lot of his clients and his own partners were rushing to come up with answers that we weren't sure were right. And he realized they were reassurances, and they weren't intended to be false reassurances. He said, but fundamentally, as leaders, we take a constructive point of view. And there's a pathology to that, is that we are perpetual optimists. And that can lead us to somehow presume that we know more than we do and to minimize things. And they even while well-intended. So to watch out for the hand-wringing, but also watch out for the cheerleading was some of the great advice that they've had. Joe Ukazoglu of Deloitte had just said that they had to teach all their most senior partners to always communicate, here's what we know, here's what we don't know, and here's how we close the gap between them. That isn't the way a lot of the familiar CEOs that the questioner asked about usually come on with a sense of certainty that that isn't what the current generation of business leaders is learning as important as how to address uncertainty in an honest way and to be forgiving about missteps.
Thank you so much. So we've seen throughout history that crises are times of great innovation. And we know that the world is suffering some great economic impacts, but there's also a lot of opportunities. Do you think these opportunities and this new innovation that we might be seeing as a result of the COVID crisis will be coming from corporations, entrepreneurs? How do you see business making a pivot as we, emerge from this long campaign?
Well, despite from the politics, the celebration of science is really important, as we are seeing right now. The companies like Gilead and Regeneron and the Pfizer, Merck, in a rush to answer the public interest. And this ties back to one of your earlier questions about seeing social purpose still reified or challenged right now. is those are companies which are sacrificing parochial self-interest and immediate shareholder returns for the greater good. And I think that's very encouraging to see that happen. And that's an innovation, but it's innovation in the public interest. That's quite exciting to see the scientific and biotech communities come together on that front. Some other forms of innovation, this may sound modest, but just how we communicate in using remote ways of working, that to the perils of the travel industry and the theater industry, and hopefully not to the university world and things, we've gotten pretty comfortable. No matter how ham-handed I may be looking on handling this Zoom technology, most of us have gotten better at it. And that means we're going to see a lot more work at home. In most places, the head of global equities at Bank of America had a misstatement a month or so ago, where he had suggested, if you're not at your desks, we don't want to hear the whining. If you want a job here, you have to be here. Of course, that was an outlier in the financial community, and they had to walk that back. As the financial community, most 90% of them are working at home. And this is true of a lot of places. There's going to be a big ripple effect on commercial real estate, but also innovation in how we function as leaders, as bosses, as managers, dealing with isolation, dealing with rumor control, information. The CEO, just coming back to McKinsey, for example, Kevin Nieder, has every Thursday morning, he does a town meeting where the whole McKinsey employment workforce is able to tune into it, no matter where they are in the world and what time zone. Even though it's recorded to see later, 75% of them tune in to see it live. Joe Kazaglu, the CEO of Deloitte, runs basically a 24-hour Q&A session, where somebody can type in a question at any point and get an answer that the whole organization hears. 500,000 people or whatever can hear that answer, and that's pretty impressive. But the communication challenge is a great one too. That's new and different in terms of innovation. An area of major concern to your constituency that has an elevated appreciation of this is we're seeing, paradoxically right now, 4 senators this week, Lawley, Tom Cotton, is the Ted Cruz and Grassley, disappointingly, people who are usually very smart and often very forward-thinking, are looking for immigration controls on H-1B visas. Complete suspension. We already have a 25% reduction in dismissal of applications. We've never had that before. It's been 8 to 10% in bad years for getting folks in the country with highly skilled workers to come in scientific and technology and university world. Is to cut that off would certainly go against the kind of innovation you're talking about. So we worry about that. Hopefully that's an outlier, but already under an executive order from the White House in the spring of 2017, we've had dramatic cutbacks, and we have to celebrate innovation by also celebrating immigration. There's all the research. There's just no research contrary to this that shows that the flow of immigrants into this country is not displacing longstanding U.S. nationals. In fact, it's job creating, and somehow organizations like the World Affairs Council really stand for a celebration of world cooperation. In addition to the associations and organizations, we have to celebrate the flow of talent and knowledge that way for that innovation to thrive.
So I have another question from the audience. This is about Boston Consulting Group and other consulting groups like it. So we know that the state of Connecticut has retained BCG to advise in respect to the reopening process. What do you know about the track record of the consulting industry globally in advising governments dealing with public health crises?
I don't know specifically about the BCG engagement. I am a member of the Advanced CT organization, which is something that used to be called the Connecticut Economic Resource Center, as you know. And we're a group of volunteers that are mainly from the business community and some from academia. Judy Olean, the president of Quinnipiac, for example, is another academic there, and others from the independent sector. I believe Garrett Sheehan, the head of the Greater New Haven Chamber of Commerce, I believe is a member. There are others, but there are a lot of business leaders. Indra Nooyi, of retired of PepsiCo chair, and Jim Smith, who of course the retired CEO and chair of Webster Financial, are on there volunteering too. And we're working very much on the reopening of the state, but also in trying to attract business in here. But and some of those guys, some of those people were working on the reopening that led to the introduction of BCG to the team. I wasn't a part of all that, and I don't know what BCG specifically is doing, but they're a fantastic consulting firm, and they came into work on a volunteer basis for no compensation on a project on workforce retraining in this state that I worked on with Indra years ago before the governors changed or this and anything else. However, McKinsey, BCG, Booz Allen, Bain, they all do have a nonprofit sector focus to some extent, and those nonprofit businesses, independent sector, can be very good, but it does worry me in general is to make sure that we aren't getting cookie cutter solutions from any of these firms, that there are people that actually have expertise in the areas and aren't just generalists. Many of these consulting firms, you will get very smart people that are generalists in background and don't have, in this case, do they have the public health and epidemiological and economic development and virology or whatever critical care expertise that's needed. I don't know that they do. Some maybe do. And also, is it not just going to be the same boxes and charts and arrows, flow charts and things that were used in 10 other states on parallel seeming projects? Because in fact, the conditions are very, very, very much state to state. Obviously, where there's greatest population congestion and the kinds of commerce there should be very much customized to the state. I sometimes, as you might worry, that the trade-off of not being too parochial and limited by having only your state officials wrestle with the problem. They don't have the experience what others have done. Sometimes when we learn with a more cosmopolitan point of view to learn from the experience of others, we don't want to necessarily copy and transpose the experience of others if it doesn't fit here. So you always want to push your consultants hard to make sure that's customized and tailor fit to us. And I don't know that as clients, any of us regularly do a good job as clients. A consulting firm will only be as good as a client pushback would be. And we should never roll over and play dead to a client, whether or not they're working for free or for compensation.
So we're running out of time, but as a last question, let me ask you, what lessons should CEOs and corporations learn from this crisis? How will this moment permanently impact the future of the private sector?
Well, the biggest disruption is the focus on obviously health of customers and employees, of colleagues. Thinking of us as work communities is one of the biggest changes, and our interdependence with one another. That's the huge takeaway. Second has to do with the technology, of course, and ways we're going to be working remotely and when it's appropriate and when it's not appropriate. But proximity really matters. As much as I'm enjoying this session with you, if we were together in person, there'd be sidebar comments. There'd be I would be able to see is who's looking back at me skeptically, and I would go after and try to address them to see how I've lost them, or looking at factions form or whatever it is, that there's so much meta language and other forms of relationship building that don't happen through this technology, but it allows other opportunities in terms of flexibility. I'm not wearing shoes, for example, but seriously, the technology trade-offs. A third thing though also has to do with the meetings. In a time of crisis, there are frankly too many meetings with too many people that are meeting for too long. Not this one. This is too short, if you ask me. I don't know if there's anybody still listening to us, but I still think it's too short. And it couched in COVID, a lot of people want to seem like they are essential workers. So we have so many meetings rehashing so many of the same things that not just CEOs, but I hear from all kinds of people that they feel they're tethered to the technology. They can't get away. Here, working at home, they thought they'd have more flexibility, but we're seeing messaging going out from bosses to employees at 3 a.m. Where are you? I've been sending you a message. I operate on East Coast time, no matter where you are in different part of the world. Is we have to figure out how we handle the the technology better. It isn't just stapling it onto our impulses, but in fact, too many meetings, running too long with too little planning. And if I'm saying all that, I better shut myself off and not let us run too long.
Jeffrey Sonnenfeld, one of the world's most preeminent experts on global corporate governance and global corporate leadership. Thank you so much for joining us today. I look forward to the time to be able to welcome you up here in Hartford in person, and hopefully we can talk again soon.
I'd be honored. Thank you so much, Megan. Thanks again, Amanda.
Thank you, everyone. Everyone stay safe and well, and we'll see you soon.